So this is from Ralph and Carley from Washington, D.C. They say, we're planning to retire to Maui when COVID-19 is over and have three questions at this time. Number one, what are the real estate taxes for full-time single home residents in Maui based on the recent regulations? We haven't been able to get clear answers from our research. Number two, we are concerned about the drought conditions and water supply on the west coast of Maui. Last year's fires reminded us of California, which we are trying to avoid. Number three, finally, we hear general references to lower availability of medical treatment on the islands other than Oahu. As we are in our mid-60s, but both healthy and active, this is of concern. Can you address the availability of medical services on Maui? So a bunch of questions over there. So kind of why don't we kind of hit those in order? Why don't you kind of start with, let's talk about the taxes and then roll into the drought on Maui and in the access to medical care. And there's another one, we'll talk about the Ohana unit, but let's just kind of hit this one first.
Sure. Well, great questions. First of all, so for taxes in Maui County for a single family residence, those are determined by how the property is being used. And there's two main categories. There's owner occupied, which would be your primary residence. And there's non-owner occupied, meaning it would be a second home or a long-term rental. And then just recently for the 2020-2021 fiscal tax year, they've introduced a few tiered systems, a few tiers within those categories. So there's a slight bump in tax rate when you go from an assessed value of 800,000 to 1.5 million, and then a slight bump again for assessed values over 1.5 million. But in general, just to give you an example, so a single family home on Maui that is being used as a primary residence, that's $1 million. A homeowner would pay about $2,000 in property tax annually. And that is also taking into consideration homeowners will receive a $200,000 exemption off the assessed value of their home to start, and then they're taxed at that lower tax rate.
Really quick, that that number, so $1 million, just get a recap here, $1 million home, the tax rate on that would be give or take about $2,000 a year is what you're saying.
Right, because you take $200,000 off the assessed value, so it'd be like $800,000, and then you're taxed at that homeowner tax rate, which is quite low. So
I was going to say quite low. It's like, you're originally from Illinois. I'm sure you have some family there. Illinois property taxes, even in small farm towns, I think are much, much higher than that, I would think, right?
Yes. So property taxes on Maui compared to most areas on the mainland are very, very low. Now, if that same $1 million home was a second home or non-owner occupied, the property tax on that home would be closer to $5,600 a year. So there is a difference in whether you're using it as your primary residence or not.
What we're saying on the primary residence side is, for example, if you have a vacation home in Maui, and then let's say you live on it doesn't matter whether you live on Maui or not, right? If it's just not your primary home, if it's a home, if it's a second property, you're renting it out, whether you live on Maui or not, the second property, like you said, if it's same $1 million property would be at $5,600 a year. Is that right?
Right. So when you are relocating to Maui, though, it might take some time because you have to file taxes in the state and then apply for your homeowner exemption. So initially, when you purchase a home, you're going to acquire whatever tax rate the previous owner had, which is really interesting. And then it takes about a year to turn over. But anyway, property taxes compared to a lot of areas are pretty low. Now, if not to go off on a tangent, but there's another tax rate for short-term rentals, and that's a bit higher again too.
I think that might be important to a lot of our viewers because we get a lot of questions that folks saying, hey, I'd like to get, can I get a For example, can we get a property that we come to Maui, like snowbirds, which I'm sure you're familiar with, right? These are what we call the snowbirds, people who come from, like, let's say, Canada. They kind of, or elsewhere in the world, they come and they live in their condo for, let's say, 3 months, and then they leave, and then they kind of rent out the condo for the rest of the year as short-term rentals, or commonly Airbnb, etc. What does that look like? What's the property tax rate for, like, an Airbnb, if you were to kind of Airbnb your condo?
Sure. So property tax for a short-term rental is $1.10 per 1,000 of assessed value, or about 1.1% roughly of value. So it's definitely at a bit higher rate for the short-term rentals. But I mean, the idea is that you're going to be earning some income on that property when you're not using it. So, that's why they tax it at a
Right.
higher.
So 1.1%. My math has atrophied. I can only do single digit mathematics these days. I need a calculator for everything else. But I think 1.1% of a million, that same $1 million property, 1.1 would be 11,000 a year. I think so. It'd be 11,000 a year. So you're looking at, if you look at those three different levels, if you, same $1 million property, if you lived in it, it would be about 2,000 a year. If it was not your primary residence, your secondary, whatever, not primary, you'd be paying, you said, about 2,600 a year, right? Is that what you said? 2,600?
600. About
I'm sorry, what?
5,600.
56. Thank you. 5,600. And if you kind of Airbnb it, it'd be 11,000. That's the
Yeah,
give or take. Is all rough numbers.
yeah,
right?
roughly. I mean, the way they introduced this new tiered system, you need an Excel spreadsheet to figure it out, but
Right.
it gives you
And
a ballpark idea.
and that's, I think that's all people want, is a ballpark. And these are good. And these things, this tier, this just come into did this just come in this year? Is this something recent with legislation on Maui?
It did, yeah, just for this upcoming year. So it used to be a straight tax rate regardless of value. So now if your value's under 800,000, it's at one tax rate. If it's 800,000 to 1.5 million, that next section of value gets taxed at a little bit higher rate, and then above 1.5 million is a little bit higher. But the way they set the rates, it's so small of a difference. It's almost anyway.
Got it. And like you said, you need to have an Excel spreadsheet to figure it out, which is great for all the accountants who get hired. Okay, good. Let's hit this next one. What about a drought on West Maui? So to repeat that question, we're concerned about the drought conditions and water supply on the west coast of Maui. Heidi, what's going on with the west coast of Maui, if anything? What's kind of happening there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if I'm answering the specific question, but what I'm guessing is this might be related to last year in 2019. There were quite a few fires on Maui in general. In central Maui, in Kihei, there was one in Paia, and also in West Maui. It was just a really dry and windy year. Because of the shape of the island and the mountains, there's going to be a lot of different microclimates on Maui. I mean, there's some areas where it rains every single day and is very wet and green. And then there's some areas where it's really dry. I mean, even just in the area of West Maui, you have drier areas like Laniapoko, and then you go up to Napili, Kapalua. It's rainier, greener, wetter. So, I mean, I think that's always something that comes into play when looking for a home, is just finding the right climate. I mean, you can drive 2 minutes and be in a slightly different climate area. So
yeah, that's what's so cool about Hawaii, right? You can just kind of basically, drive to your climate. What do you want? You want desert, you want rainforest, you want ocean, you want mountain, yeah, it's really cool. So what I'm catching from you is there isn't a sort of, drought condition per se, a dangerous drought condition. It's just more like perhaps the fires or whatever's going on, but it's not, there's no water, or West Maui is burning up, sort of a thing. That's what I'm catching from you.
No, I mean there's no present condition of drought, but I mean I'm pretty sure this is in reference to last year because we did have some fires here last year. It was a really dry year, and that
Right.
was a concern.
So yeah, so it was a dry year. Dry years come and dry years go, and some years are dry years and some years are wet years. And this was a dry year, and it happened to we had some unfortunate fires as well. But that was basically there's nothing a long term global warming catastrophe. West Maui is not a place that will stay away from because there's no water there. Okay, good, great, excellent. Um, let's look at their kind of recap on that. Repeat their other question about medical care, right? So they say finally we hear general references to lower availability of medical treatment on the islands other than Oahu. We're in our 60s. We're both healthy, but this is of concern. Now, I've spoken about this in other videos that clearly Oahu. There's no question that Oahu has because it's the city of a million people, it's got the kind of healthcare facilities that a city of a million people will. But Heidi, why don't you speak to this? For clients of yours or people who have asked you, they're in their mid-60s. Hey, what's the healthcare? What's the available? What's the hospitals like? What's the healthcare for? What's it like in Maui for someone who, again, in their they're saying mid-60s.
Sure, great question. Well, the main hospital on Maui is Maui Memorial, and it's located in central Maui in Wailuku. There's also a small hospital in Kula upcountry, and then in South Maui and West Maui and Hana, there's urgent care facilities and medical centers. Of course, Oahu has the largest population center in the state, and that's going to have the most medical facilities, as you mentioned. So for some more specialty medical care, somebody might travel to Oahu, which is about a 25-minute flight. And that's really similar to how any small regional hospital might send somebody to a bigger city for more specialty type of medical care. Yeah, it's about 25 minutes away, but we do have a hospital here.
I've told folks that if I have friends, for example, who live on the Big Island, who good friend, her husband needs some sort of a procedure to be performed. I don't know if it's a dialysis or something kind of heavy duty, and they have to fly to Oahu once a month to get that done. So for those kind of things, and so what would so what's your general feeling here? What's your general feeling about what should someone in their mid-60s be thinking about or be concerned about or not be concerned about when it comes to access to healthcare facilities on Maui?
I mean, I think it's that kind of plays into where you want to live too, because some places on Maui are going to be farther from a hospital and an airport than others. Some people have specific medical treatments that are needed on a regular basis, so I think that would be a concern. But I mean, if you're just thinking of routine regular care, I live in West Maui. I can go into Lahaina. It's 10 minutes away, and they have a doctor's office there. And they can do basic things. I mean, like I mentioned before, for something more severe, I mean, you might end up going to Oahu.
Right. Yeah. So your general care, your doctor's visits are kind of like just like anything else. You go to the doctor's office. There's doctor's offices there. There's healthcare. There are healthcare facilities. There is a hospital on Maui, but for the heavy duty stuff, you may have to fly to Oahu. I think that's pretty fair.